Kia ora, I'm Chelsea Daniels, and this is The Front Page, a daily podcast presented by the New Zealand Herald. For the past month, Kiwis have been able to have their say on proposals to change our telecommunications sector. Minister for Regulation David Seymour has said these services are as essential as power and water, and that changing the way the sector is regulated will affect almost every Kiwi. Changes could include introducing a consumer code, replacing or phasing out current obligation frameworks, and getting rid of obsolete rules. But what does all of that actually mean? And do enough New Zealanders know how these changes could affect our everyday lives? Today on the front page, tech commentator Bill Bennett is with us to dive into the recommendations and why consumers should care about how their connectivity is regulated. First off, Bill, do you think the telecommunications sector's regulatory framework is fit for purpose at the moment?
It's pretty good. I mean, it's working in terms of competition. Our market is as competitive as any market could be. Compare our telecommunications market with, say, the supermarket sector, and it's intensely competitive. It's so competitive that the companies sometimes whinge that it's so competitive they can't make as much profit as they might make. So from that point of view, it's working. From the consumer point of view, it's working too, because there's a lot of things in place to protect consumers and keep consumers from being exploited. So from those points of view, it's working quite well. There are some issues that probably need to be addressed, and there's a regulatory review going on right now, which is going over those issues. One of the problems historically is that telecommunications, like anything in technology, moves quite fast, and legislation doesn't tend to move very fast. But in New Zealand, we have something called the Telecommunications Act, and I think the Telecommunications Act goes back to 2001. Since 2001, there's been 13 amendments, so it's amended every couple of years. And a lot of those amendments along the way have been to update it. So it had a really big amendment about 5 or 6 years ago to get ready for the fibre regime. So there's a huge set of new rules coming in for fibre. In fact, the last amendment, I think, was in March this year. So it's not like it's left to just stew and get out of date.
Why are they fiddling with it then if it's doing all right?
Well, I think two things. One is there's a bit of ideology in that the government wants to cut down on the amount of regulations there are, full stop. And it's a good place to start because although it's a very complicated set of regulations and so on, the industry is relatively simple. It's only a handful of big players. So it's relatively easy to deal with. It's much easier to deal with that than tackling some of the harder things like, say, supermarkets. And the other thing is there's some pressure from inside the industry to reform some of the regulation. But in general, there's not a lot of push from inside the sector to reform things.
What are the most significant recommendations, do you think?
Well, at the review that's coming along at the moment, they haven't got recommendations yet. They've just asked for input from the industry and from various stakeholder groups. I think they're due to report this Thursday on that input from the industry and from stakeholders. I don't think there are actual recommendations at the moment, but there are topics that they're looking at. And one of the things they're looking at, for example, is whether the rules around fibre, for example, are up to date. Well, they are. It pretty much is. But there are some kind of historic things in there that maybe we don't need anymore. Like a lot of the rules that are around to do with copper networks. Well, the copper networks are going out there, but by 2030, the copper networks will be completely closed, and we're down to perhaps 120,000 people that are relying on copper today, which isn't very much in the bigger scheme of things. So there's a lot of fussing over things that no longer really apply. It's a bit like the old thing with the London taxis having to carry a bale of hay on the top for the horses long after the horses are gone and the taxis are all cars.
Tell me, what is the telecommunications service obligations and why should it be phased out or replaced? I know that that's something that they're looking at.
Yeah, look, when it's a historic thing. Telecom originally was the post office, and it was government owned, it was state controlled, and it was run as a public service, and it had public service obligations. And some of the things were like remote places would get a telephone box and a telephone line, and they didn't have to pay more for it. So even if you were in the middle of nowhere, you had some kind of telecommunications. The industry was seen as go back 100 years, it was seen as a nation-building exercise to have all that in place so that, a cow cocky on a farm in the middle of nowhere could ring home for the weekend or whatever from a coin box. Then around about the late 80s, it got privatised. Telecom got privatised and it got bought out by at the time, some overseas interests. And the obligations were put in place so that the things that had been social goods that were around, forever until then, continued after privatisation. And then when competitors came in, the idea was the things to keep happening. And some of those things are still important today, like 111 calling, for example, is part of that. And there's a relay service for people that are hard of hearing, so that you don't need to, listen to a voice call. There are other ways of getting the information for those people, and that's all paid for by the government. But it has to be provided by the industry. So what the TSO is really all about is about getting private companies to continue those services. And there's money for that, some government money, and some of it comes from a levy which is charged on the industry. And the industry currently pays $10 million a year. The amount a company pays is based on how much money they make. So Spark would pay the most, and I think Chorus pays the second most, and then it's 1 and 2 degrees and so on. And those four companies probably pay about 90% of the levy, and all the smaller ones pay a small amount. But the money that comes in from that is used to do things like subsidise rural calling, subsidise services that are necessary. And that's really what it's about. The thing is that it was essential when telecom was privatised for those things to carry on. It's not so important today when you've got mobile phones and satellite communications in remote places and so on, and alternative options. But there's a second area of concern, and it's what's called the digital divide. There's a divide between rich people, and poor people have difficulty paying for some of these services, and they certainly have difficulty paying for things like computers and so on to use digital services. But there's also a rural digital divide, and that is that services don't reach everywhere. The fibre network goes to 87% of the country, but that leaves 13%, which is off the fibre network. And some of those people are still dependent on copper lines, and that's kind of got to be looked after by everyone. It's a sort of society problem, not an industry problem, and that's what it's about. And it's as you say, it's likely to be phased out, given that we're moving to a world where everything's on mobile, the copper network's gone, and if you're really stuck out in the wop-wops, you can use satellite. So.
Is there a fear, though, that if we get rid of all of the rules and regulations, that, say, a town with a population of 10 could be left out and left off the map because they're not then, seen as profitable for those big companies to install those networks?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. But back in the day of when it was a public service, I talked to the people who ran Telecom back in the 80s. I've been around this business for a long time, and I remember someone telling me that there was a phone line to the Oronga Lodge, which is right at the bottom of the Wairarapa on the coast. And it was the longest single stretch of copper wiring in the network at the time. So the head of Telecom at the time told me that it literally cost millions every year for that line to exist. But that was being subsidised by all the people in Karori and places like that where they live next to each other and right close to an exchange, and it cost nothing to connect their lines. So that kind of cross-subsidy was there, and it's not there in a commercial era. That would be true. Except it is there in some ways, because the fibre network build has been subsidised, and the fibre network going into rural towns has been paid for by various government projects over the years. So during the lockdowns, there was a big rural development budget, which a lot of that money was spent on sending fibre into those regional areas.
If we don't have those kind of obligations in place, though, do we run the risk of, having some towns and some people who live rurally just cut off the map? I mean, I know that 3G is being phased out, and I don't know if you've tried to drive the length of the country, but there are definitely some pretty large dark spots in between there where we can't get internet.
Absolutely. And again, some of that TDL money, that levy money, has been spent on something called the Rural Connectivity Group, which it's basically the three main telcos, the Spark, 2 Degrees and One, in a joint venture, and they build towers along remote roads. And Chorus puts fibre between some of the towers. Most of the towers have fibre to them, and it goes to places like Milford Sound. There's a fibre now that goes into Milford Sound, and there's phone towers all along that road. That's a pretty remote road, but we're not there with 100% coverage for sure. But we improved. It's massively improved, and those builds are generally paid for by governments or from the levy.
At the end of last year, Optus was hit with a $12 million fine over people not being able to connect to 000. Now it has happened again, and only this time at least 3 people have died. What is next for Optus? If your network fails on a 000 call, your phone is meant to switch over to a different network to get through. This is a mechanism telcos must have in place as per this act, and in this instance, it's clear that even the backup plans failed customers. Warning signs were there in 2023, and now Australia's Communications Minister says the telco giant will face significant consequences.
Now, we've seen in Australia recently exactly how reliant we are on our telco sectors. Australian officials have promised that Optus will face significant consequences over a systems outage, and it's linked to multiple deaths. The incident left hundreds of people across more than half of the country unable to call emergency services for 13 hours. At least 3 people died as a result. Could something similar happen here?
Yes, but no. And by that, I mean, it's complicated. But look, when Cyclone Gabrielle came through, people were cut off for long periods of time. The networks are quite resilient, but they're not resilient enough. And Gabrielle exposed that. Up until Gabrielle, we thought that if you had a handful of cables going into an area like, I think it was Hawke's Bay that was worst affected, towns like Wairoa in Hawke's Bay, they had a handful of lines going into those places, but the lines went across bridges, and the bridges were wiped out, and they cut the lines. And it turns out that having 2 or 3 lines in isn't enough. You need more. So we're building resilience into the network, and we've been doing a lot of work on that since Gabrielle. And Gabrielle was quite a wake-up call for that. But the other thing is that increasingly we can use satellites to get around that as well. So if part of the country is cut off because the main links are down, satellite can fill in the gaps, and you probably won't be able to stream Netflix in high definition if you're in one of those areas during that time. But you will be able to make voice calls, and you will be able to make basic email calls and send text messages and so on. So it's less likely in New Zealand because we do have more resilience. But the interesting thing about that Australian episode was that the answer to it, the government sees the answer to it, and the industry sees the answer to that as fixing the regulations, which is back to what we were talking about in the first place, about all those regulations. They're in place for a purpose. They're not there just because bureaucrats enjoy imposing rules on the industry.
Right. So Australia is looking at more regulations, and we're looking at scaling them back.
Yes. There's an element of truth in that. We probably, my guess is that the review is not going to scale them back that much. There'll be some tinkering. There'll be some things that go. There's probably a couple of things which are past their sell-by date, like the rules around copper and so on. But in general, I think we have, and it's widely understood, and even within the industry, it's widely understood, we have actually very good regulations in this area.
And in terms of, you see something like have your say for the telecommunications sector regulatory framework, and your everyday Kiwi would just look at that and turn the page, right? Why should everyday Kiwis care about this?
There are people that are organised to do that. So, for example, in rural areas, there are groups that lobby for rural telecommunications. There's a Connecting Aotearoa Summit, which was in Hamilton earlier this year, which was run by TUANZ. Now, TUANZ used to be the telecommunications users group of New Zealand, but it's now the technology users of New Zealand. They advocate on behalf of users, and they would put in submissions to things like that, but also things like the rural doctors would put in a submission, and federated farmers would put in submissions, and there are rural women's groups and so on which submit. So rather than having to read this stuff yourself and get on top of what can be quite complicated sets of rules and so on, go and talk to one of those organisations that would represent you.
Thanks for joining us, Bill.
You're welcome.
That's it for this episode of The Front Page. You can read more about today's stories and extensive news coverage at nzherald.co.nz. The Front Page is produced by Jane Yee and Richard Martin, who is also our editor. I'm Chelsea Daniels. Subscribe to The Front Page on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts, and tune in tomorrow for another look behind the headlines.